So today's character of focus is Lydia, the first woman we've had in a while in this list. We'll go on a decent run of women to study here in the near future, because once we get to M, there are like 32 Marys to talk about, and Martha, and so on. But for now, Lydia. Her name, obviously, nobody really knows. And it's also possible that Lydia wasn't even her actual name. As you can see, it has been suggested that that could have been a designation based on where she was from, because Thyatira was in the province of Lydia, and some scholars think that there is a possibility that this woman was actually let me find it here, Euodia or Syntyche. That's the best you're going to get from me in Philippians 4:2, I think is the scripture there. But that's just one of those take it or leave it things. I'll just take her name as what it says to be a proper name. It sounds like it could be a proper name to me. But even so, the meaning is uncertain. But what is certain is who she was. She was a businesswoman from Thyatira who was not just a businesswoman, but she was a godly and devout woman. And she would eventually, fatefully, for lack of a better word, would become the first beneficiary of the Macedonian call. So in Acts 16, whenever Paul had this vision of a man saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." I'll just go ahead and throw this map up here. So Lydia was from Thyatira. Now, whether that means she actively lived in Thyatira or that's just where her origin was, it could go either way. The text itself could go either way. She was from the city of Thyatira, but I think the general consensus is that she did live in Thyatira. But at the time when Paul finds her, she was not in Thyatira at all. She was a decent distance away in Philippi. So here's Macedonia, and I think some of this is maybe considered Macedonia as well, but at least this was Paul's second missionary journey. If you remember, when he was here at Antioch of Pisidia, he was going to go into Asia, but the Spirit said, "Don't go there." So instead, they sort of went around it and stayed in Troas, and it was in Troas here on the coast that he received that vision that said of the man from Macedonia saying, or the man saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And Luke records that they interpreted that vision to mean we need to go there. That's where we need to go next. So they go, they take the ship here, land at Neapolis, and then head over to Philippi. So Philippi is where we meet Lydia. But when we meet her in the text, Luke informs us that she was a woman from Thyatira. Now, Thyatira is over here in Asia Minor. Ironically, the place where the Lord or the Spirit told Paul not to go, yet anyway, he finds a woman from there in Macedonia, or in Philippi, on the way to Macedonia, or I guess that is right there in the northeastern corner of Macedonia. So he finds a woman from Asia Minor in Macedonia, in Philippi. So that's where Lydia was from. And here's the thing about the difference between whether she lived in Thyatira or was just from there is a commentary on how successful of a businesswoman she actually seems to have been. Because we know she had a house in Philippi. So that would mean that was her second house. And that sounds like a big deal. some of us here have 2 houses. Most of us don't, okay? So I almost said, how many of us have 2 houses? And I realized, well, half of your hands would go up because, yeah, anyway. Dean, do you have something? Okay. So most people don't have 2 houses. And but, okay, if she had her first house in Thyatira, which, by the way, was the place that was notorious for what she did. She was a seller of purple. So most of the versions say, or the older versions, I think it's worded just like that. A seller of purple. The ESV adds the word goods. So she was a seller of purple goods, purple things. And what that is a reference to is working with dyes. So back then, I would think dyeing was a lot different than it is now. D-Y-E, dyeing. Dyeing has generally always been the same. But D-Y-E-ing was probably different then because now we have all sorts of witchcraft and labs and who knows where this stuff comes from that they make these things from. But apparently, according to the handout here, the water of that area was so suited and to dyeing that nobody else could produce such a rich scarlet or purple dye for cloth as the people of Thyatira in that area could. So it became, obviously, if you wanted that, which was a very, even today is sort of associated with royalty and probably wealth. So if you wanted that, it's like, well, I know the place to go. I mean, you want to get it from there. They're the best. So the best of the best. That's where she was from. That's what she did. And presumably, it was a fairly lucrative business. Even if she didn't have 2 houses, she still seems to, that's what she did. And this makes her kind of a unique woman, because, especially in the New Testament narrative, because this is not the norm, is it? We see a woman, there's no reference to a man in her life at all. Go feminism, right? Yeah, whatever. Anyway, did she inherit this business from her late husband or something? We don't know. All we know is she's an independent woman who has her own business, and she's pretty good at it. So, but that's not what we should remember about her. What we should remember about her is, as I guess the summary of her legacy that I just sort of emphasized there, highlighted, she was the first Christian in Macedonia, as far as we know. Because you see, the implication is, in Paul, let me just rewind back. In Paul's first journey, all 3 started at Antioch, Syria. Their first journey was just through Cyprus, and then they came up and they sort of went back around, and that was it. They didn't go very far. The second one is where I said went up here, and this is where the obvious implication of the Macedonian call is the gospel had not been there yet. Not just Paul hadn't been there yet, but the gospel hadn't been there yet. Now, maybe that's not true, but that seems to be the significance of the Macedonian call, is the gospel hadn't come to Macedonia at all yet. That would make Lydia the very first convert in the whole region of Macedonia. So, which also makes her household the beginning of the church in Macedonia, which happened to be at Philippi. So this makes the book of Philippians also relevant to Lydia, because as far as we can tell, her house was the beginning of the church at Philippi. Whenever we read, which we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, kind of spoiled the whole thing already, but that's who she was. The book here calls her the woman who was diligent in business. Sure, okay, but again, I don't know if Lydia would want that to be her her legacy, because she was a lot more than that. So here's what we read about her. It's just 5 verses. that we read about her specifically until she pops up again very briefly at the end of the chapter. So, Acts 16:11 says, setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace. I know that's not how you pronounce it, but that's what I see. And the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city some days. So Paul gets the vision to go to Macedonia. They go to Macedonia, but he's got no idea what to do next. Now what? Here we are. We've made it. We're in Macedonia. Now what? On the Sabbath day, as we talked about earlier, what would Paul normally have done? He'd go to synagogue. Well, guess what? There's not always going to be a synagogue. So I can imagine now Paul's really at a loss, because what next? Well, obvious. We'll wait for the Sabbath day and go to synagogue. Apparently there was no synagogue at Philippi, it seems, or for whatever reason, they didn't go there. And I think that's the natural conclusion, is there wasn't one. There were certain requirements to have a synagogue in a town. But Jewish requirements, I guess that would be. So on the Sabbath day, instead it says, Luke says, we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. So already we're learning something. There was a place, in lieu of a synagogue, there was a place that was sort of appointed as this gathering place, specifically for prayer. And women gathered there. Now, here's the context to the synagogue situation. There had to be 10 Jewish men, at least, or maybe Jewish families, but mainly men, to have a synagogue. So it makes sense then that it's mainly or only women meeting at this riverside. That's perfectly in line with no synagogue would imply few Jewish men, which would explain why there are women gathering here at the riverside to pray. Dean, do you have something else? Yeah. They may have just come together regularly to pray privately. They could we're all here together, but we're praying on our own. They could have been praying out loud, whatever it is. But because there was no synagogue, and I think the text here, it doesn't say she was a Jewish proselyte, but there's a decent chance she was, based on this context. But at any rate, what we're told about her is that one of those women was named Lydia from Thyatira, seller of purple goods. But here's the big one. She was a worshiper of God. Now, what does that mean? Well, in this context, it could mean basically only one of two things. She was either a proselyte, a Jewish proselyte. I guess three things. She could have just been a Jewish woman, but that doesn't necessarily follow. She could have been a Jewish proselyte, or she could have been like Cornelius, who was neither Jew nor proselyte, but he was a godly, devout man who was pursuing the true God. Maybe Lydia was in the same class as he was. But then we read that her heart was opened to pay attention to what was said by Paul. Yeah, Dean?
Well, this might have been one of the reasons that Paul was told to go to Macedonia, because God knew that Lydia would have been there and that she was a God-fearing person.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of things that we don't know all this, but
Yep. So while the vision that Paul had in the Macedonian call was of a man from Macedonia standing there saying, come to Macedonia, the first people that they encounter in Macedonia seems to be all women. At least those are the ones that Luke mentions. And since he says, we spoke to the women who had come together, would either imply they, for some reason, specifically didn't speak to the men, or that only women were there. And the second one makes a lot more sense. Why would you only speak to the women? Well, the women who had come together would seem to suggest it was only women who had come together. So this is just as good of a breeding ground for the gospel as the synagogue. Because here are some people gathered together who are praying. Even if they weren't praying to the true God, there's still something that Paul would certainly see to work with there. So he goes for it. They start preaching. I think the others probably did too. They may have had separate, conversations going, discourses with because Luke says us. One of the women, one who heard us was a woman named Lydia. But the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. First of all, let's just notice, as a successful businesswoman, it says a lot about Lydia that she took time to even think about spiritual matters. I'm sure she had a lot on her plate. We're not told why she's at Philippi, other than that she seems to live there at least part-time. But whether she's, is some sort of business venture or whatever it is, she clearly would have had a lot of business going on as the proprietor of a business like this, entrepreneur. But here she has taken time out for religion, prayer, spiritual matters. And talk about fertile soil, potentially at least. And thankfully, it proved to be actually fertile soil, very fertile soil. Pretty good start in Macedonia, if you think about it. Found these women, started preaching, and the first woman, or at least one of the women of the first group they encounter, her heart's open to pay attention. So she pays attention to what was said by Paul. I thought it was a good comment here in the handout. It says, the mind is closed, or often, I added the word often there. The mind is often closed against the full truth, either from ignorance or prejudice and cannot discern it, or from pride and perversity and will not admit it. So even though Lydia heard the gospel preached, that doesn't guarantee that she's going to listen to it. And even if she does listen to it, it doesn't guarantee she's going to be receptive to it. But she was receptive. Yeah, Joe?
Well, I think they went out knowing that there had to have been a rumor that there was a group that prayed near the riverside.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, Lydia's household, the people she had surrounding her, were also saved. So I think she had to have practiced a godly lifestyle and a devoutness. I mean, like you said, to take time from working to pray shows a devout faith in a God, the one and true God. And then for them to be led to the truth, they had to have been looking.
Yeah.
It just doesn't follow.
Naturally, Paul's going to want to find the synagogue, probably first thing. If you show up at a place for vacation or some unfamiliar place, there might be the certain kinds of place that you want to locate first and foremost. Like I want to know where the easiest gas station is. If you're going to be there for worship, where's the nearest church congregation? So I know where it is. Well, Paul's probably the first thing he's going to think about. All right, here we are. We're in the city. Where's synagogue? And whenever he finds out, and he may have already known that there was no synagogue in Philippi, but it seems they probably ask questions of the townspeople. Where's religious things take place? Is there anywhere that people, like a I see there's no synagogue. Is there any place? And it may be that that's how they came about this supposed place. Because Luke just says, we went to the riverside where we suppose there was a place of prayer. Now, did they just randomly think, well, maybe the people go to the river to pray? Probably not, unless that was a normal thing, No synagogue, well, riverside. Now, that wouldn't necessarily click in my mind, No synagogue, well, they must be at the riverside to pray. But they probably investigated a little bit, and we already talked about Luke last week. He was no stranger to that kind of thing. So they heard that there were some people who gathered on the Sabbath to pray at the riverside. So that's where they go. And
that's what the song says.
Down to the river to pray? They got it from somewhere, didn't they? I guess they got it from here, or maybe they both got it. They all got it from the same place. I don't know. It was, somebody started it, going to the river. But yeah.
Well, we wouldn't because we baptize.
Yeah. Yeah, go to the river to baptize. That makes sense. It worked out that they were at a river for that purpose. So notice this connection. Her heart was open to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And what's the very next thing that happened to her? She was baptized. Luke doesn't even mention it. He just says after she was baptized. So there's no verse. You might expect that somewhere in between here is some statement like she and Paul went down into the water, like with the eunuch, and Philip. They went down into the water, baptized her. They came up out of the water, something like that. Nothing. It's just almost like, well, duh. She believed, she paid attention to what Paul said, then she was baptized. Well, what does that show you? That Paul talked about baptism in what he was preaching. And and that would certainly be implied based on other texts. If somebody even wanted to make the connection to baptism here, they might say, nothing here about repenting or confessing or anything like that. Really doesn't even say she believed, does it? Just says she paid attention. Obviously, that's what that means.
But just like with the eunuch, though, he said he taught him Jesus.
Yeah. Then all of a sudden he says, hey, here's water. Wait a minute, what? Went from Jesus to water? He must not have been paying attention to Philip at all. Or Philip was teaching him about baptism, which is part of teaching Jesus. So Lydia pays attention to what was said by Paul, which leads to her being baptized with the same baptism that Paul was baptized with the same baptism that the 3,000 on Pentecost, Cornelius, etc., the eunuch. Here it is again, baptism, being baptized for the remission of her sins in order to, and being added to Christ, the body of Christ. Any more of that we want to? Whoops.
It's nice her household had to have been in prayer with her because they were baptized as well.
What's that? Her household?
Her household was with her, which meant they were part of the prayer service.
Yeah, maybe they were. Well, I guess, there's a couple. They were either there or the scene moves to her household where they hear about it now in addition to the group at the river. But, it makes sense that her household would be with her. And as a seemingly single woman, we don't know who her household was. Did she have children? Or were they all servants? Again, that would be a commentary on how successful of a businesswoman she was. If her whole household here, which there's no number given, but if it was all servants and people that were, attended to her, we're talking about a pretty wealthy woman. So all that is to say, make it even more impressive that she was the kind of woman she was. successful, independent businesswoman, potentially quite wealthy, and yet she was a worshiper of God, already took the time to go to the riverside to pray on the Sabbath day, and maybe was a leader of sorts in this sort of gathering. And now the thing that happens immediately after she's baptized is her whole household's baptized.
I see a lot of parallels. In other words, I'm not assuming that Lydia was single.
Wait a minute, you're not assuming what?
That Lydia was single.
Oh, okay.
Because if you look at the woman in Proverbs 31, she was one good business person. And I could see a woman who worked traveling to a seashore area to sell the stuff she had made. It doesn't mean, and even if she had a house there, it didn't mean she lived there. So, and
Well, I don't know.
her household with her. I mean, I just see a parallel between the woman in Proverbs 31 and Lydia.
Well, she is certainly a godly woman who a worshiper of God, and that's a huge part of the Proverbs 30, the woman of, that's described in Proverbs 31. Because if you take out that, you're almost positively not going to get any of the rest of the picture of the Proverbs 31 woman. Yeah, Dean?
Well, to me, it seemed like there was other women that were there. Now, they was all there, praying. I think all believed in God. But it doesn't mention if there was any other of those women that were obeyed the gospel or not. I would have thought probably some of them might have obeyed too, but we don't. The main thing is the fact that Lydia was the one, because she was the first one to speak up or not.
Yeah.
But you would think that if there was other women that were there, basically for prayer, that possibly some of the other ones would have been obeyed. Her whole household was there. So I mean, I'm sure there was other, like I say, it's not mentioned only that it's her and her house.
Yeah. So again, logically, there are a couple of possibilities. None of the other women there were also baptized, but it's not mentioned. That's one possibility. The other possibility, or a second possibility, is they weren't baptized, but only Lydia. Third possibility is the other women that were with her there were her household. So that may be the most logical conclusion, just because there were multiple women there. Lydia was baptized, and after her household as well that seems an easy connection, that the other ones were her household. So here they are, right after her, they also did so. And I don't think it's fair to assume that they did so only because she did, our master or whatever, the master of the house, so we better follow suit, I don't think that's a fair assumption. It's not fair to them. They were baptized for the same reason she was baptized. But it does say at the same time, it still says something about her influence and leadership. Because even though they did it, it was sincere on their part, there's no taking away from the fact that the kind of woman Lydia was, led them to be receptive to the truth in the same way she was. So I mean, there's so much to say about her that is reading between the lines of the text in a way, but at the same time, it's only natural. It's implied about the kind of woman she was, just based on what we're told that the kind of woman she was. So after Lydia's conversion, then we see that she urged them to stay. If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And Luke says, she prevailed upon us at the end of verse 15. I didn't think to see if any others read differently than that.
Mine says constrained.
She constrained us. Okay, thank you. She persuaded us. I think constrained and prevailed is stronger. She was not going to have it any other way. But not in an overbearing, you're going to do whatever I say kind of way, but in a plea, kind of like the Macedonian Christians, which, if you think about it, when Paul was writing to Corinth and saying the Christians in Macedonia were helping a lot, even though most of them were impoverished, and they pretty much insisted, like they gave too much, but Paul says, they pretty much forced me to take the money from them. In that kind of way, like, please, we want to help. She was being hospitable, which also shows that her house in Philippi was enough to accommodate Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke. If there were no others, we've got those four at least that we know were together. So at least 4 additional men, not counting the rest of her household. So she was hospitable. Remember what Jesus told the apostles whenever He sent them out on that limited commission about hospitality and people receptive to you. As you enter, whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. If anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave. Well, here Lydia, Paul wasn't one of them at that time, but the same principle would apply. We know that Paul did the rest of that at other times, sort of a gesture, shaking the dust off his feet and saying, we're going somewhere else because you won't listen. Lydia proved herself to be exactly what Jesus described as a worthy hostess who not only received their word, but received them into her house. And it seems that if he hadn't been taken to prison, they probably would have stayed there the remainder of their time in Philippi. Yeah.
Well, she put a qualifier in that pretty much left him with no recourse. If you judge me faithful,
Yeah.
you'll stay in my house. If he hadn't, then it would have said, no, I don't trust you, lady. What are you going to do? Offend the woman?
So you're saying that she was being devious.
No.
She was entrapping him.
That was a nice pressure. You've got 2 options.
She put a trap for him. That's what you're saying. If you think I'm faithful to the Lord, stay at my house.
She's the one who said it.
Got you, Paul.
But she,
Now what are you going to do? You're going to say I'm not faithful?
she said it in such a way. I mean,
I guess. I see that as just her saying, if any other if would have worked as well. If you judge me to be faithful, if it please you, if...
and what follows if? If you don't do what if follows, then you're saying the opposite. I don't find you faithful. I don't find you.
She's just found a way to get a compliment out of Paul. That's what it is, right?
It's just,
That way, since he stayed there, that means, that must mean he does judge me to be faithful. So, double honor there.
in a nice way.
She put nice pressure. Okay. I have no doubt it was utterly sincere and genuine, whatever it was. And like Luke said, she won. She prevailed upon us. In other words, we stayed there. She asked us, we stayed there. And it was, it's in verse 16 then that the next narrative, of that trip begins and ultimately results in the first additions to the church at Philippi, which is the jailer and his household. So now the church at Philippi consists of Lydia and her household, not to mention any other women that were there that may have been baptized, and then the jailer, his household. So whenever we turn to Philippians and, what Acts 16 records, in addition to Timothy joining Paul and Luke joining Paul, is, I should say Timothy joining Paul and Silas, and Luke joining Paul and Silas and Timothy, is the beginning of the church at Philippi. So the book of Philippians is written to the church that we read about beginning in Acts 16, and that puts Lydia right there among them. Surely she was still a member of that congregation, unless she had gone back to Thyatira, and maybe there's even more information that we don't have that we could someday learn. Very quickly, the last verse in chapter 16 is when Lydia is mentioned again. After they're sent out of the prison or leave the prison, the first thing they did was visited Lydia. And when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. So there you go. Now there are brothers there. I mean, now there are, there is a legitimate group of brethren in Christ in Philippi, starting with Lydia. Yeah, David?
God opened up her heart, she said, once she knew the way of salvation, well, she wanted to hear more. He just didn't want Paul to leave. He can't blame her because she never heard that.
Yeah. And she accepted it, A lot of times you hear something that is different than what you're used to, or is different from what you've heard. Your inclination is to resist it. But when the evidence points toward receiving it, that's when your heart better be open to receiving it. And thankfully Lydia's was. Okay, so lessons from Lydia. Number 1, being wealthy and successful, should say that, or something along those lines, does not necessarily nullify spirituality or godliness. So we've seen this in other characters. Just because you're wealthy does not automatically mean that you can't be spiritual. Abraham was very, very wealthy. 18 servants, something like that? That's very wealthy. That is more wealthy than I can imagine. But look at how godly and spiritual he was. So, okay, even just male servants, even more than. So, yes, it makes it more difficult. Jesus himself said that in the infamous, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. It will, the more stuff you have, the more difficult it is to potentially let go of the stuff. That's just common sense, The more you have, the more difficult it's going to be. The easier it'll be to want to hang on. But it does not mean it's impossible. Lydia is proof of that.
And we're all wealthy spiritually.
Yeah, we're all wealthy. You may not be a seller of purple, but we are all wealthy compared to most of the world. Number 2, those who are sincerely seeking the truth will not only find it, but also obey it. If you're sincerely seeking the truth, you're going to obey it. Once you receive it, you will listen to it. That's the difference between somebody who's sincerely seeking the truth and somebody who's not. Dean, did you have something?
I can see the example of individuals that were trying to seek the truth, and we see that God provided a way for them to get the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even will go today.
Yep.
There's individuals out in the world that are truly seeking the answer, seeking God, that God will provide a way, either direct somebody to them, or direct them to coming to the truth. So, I mean, either way, God is there, and He's always, especially for those, because we have examples that in the Bible where He did, and I believe that's still happening today. That,
Yep.
He will guide them to the truth.
The truth comes to people, or people come to the truth in various ways. Whoever it is that takes the truth to those people, find them in various unique ways. I've met people who come here into our doors. I've met people on Facebook. I've met people on Xbox. all three of which have resulted in conversions, people being converted and obeying the gospel. People who are sincerely seeking the truth, there will be a way that they will find it. They will come to it. Now, God's not going to make them obey it. And by the way, God didn't make Lydia obey it either. The fact that it says the Lord opened her heart is a euphemism for her heart was opened by what she heard. God didn't do something to Lydia that he didn't do for the eunuch, and he didn't do for the jailer, and he didn't do for anybody else. That goes against God's nature and impartiality. Number 3, provided one's business is not inherently sinful, one need not give it up to follow Christ. I don't think there's any indication that Lydia stopped selling purple. You could almost argue that wouldn't even have been helpful, because the more you have, the more you can give and help the church prosper, for that matter. Number 4, those who come to the knowledge of the truth should seek to lead others to do the same. Lead others to the same truth. Lydia, immediately, her household. So whether they were there or not, she still helped lead in that, helping them come to the truth as well. And number 5, our gifts, talents, abilities, and stations can and should be used in God's service into His glory. Kind of goes with number 3. Lydia would have been in a position that none of the other women around there would have been in. She's going to be interacting with people. She's going to come across people in her business, that every one of which is an opportunity to potentially spread the gospel even more.